Good evening. I'm Councillor Peter Bolton, Chairman of this Audit and Governance Committee, which is being webcast. Tony Jarvis is my Vice Chairman, and Andrew Small is a strategic director, and I have my fellow councillors and other officers present who will introduce themselves as necessary. Thank you. I would like to remind everybody present that this meeting will be broadcast live to the internet or filmed and will be capable of repeated viewing or another use by third parties. If you're seated in the lower public seating area, then it is likely that the recording cameras will capture your image, and this will result in the possibility that your image will become part of the broadcast. This may infringe your human and data protection rights, and if you wish to avoid this, then you should move to the upper public gallery. Could I please remind members to activate their microphones before speaking, and apart from me, turn them off after they're speaking. Thank you. Item 2, apologies for absence.
Apologies received from Councillor Simon Heap.
Thank you. Moving on to item 3, declarations of interest. Are there any? No? Thank you. Moving on to 4, I present the minutes and ask if there are any objections to the minutes or comments to be made on the accuracy of the minutes. No, thank you. I will then sign those. Thank you. Matters arising. I believe there are no matters arising. We now move on to item 6, the Audit and Governance Committee work programme, which is to be noted. This is the last meeting of this year, so there will be potentially a new work programme in the next year. But are there any comments to be made about the work programme? Thank you. We accept that. Thank you. Item 7, the Internal Audit Progress Report. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. So we met as a committee in February, so it's quite a light touch report because we haven't had time to do as much work as we would normally. So we have finalised one audit, that's on sundry debtors. When we originally started the audit, we got halfway through it, it was going to be limited assurance, but we've been working with officers to make sure that the weaknesses that we found have been addressed. So it's a new debtor system called ASH that's been implemented, and there have been weaknesses around the suspense account and also around outstanding debts. Officers, as I say, have been working extremely hard in the background to get those sorted out, and so we were able to give it reasonable assurance. Talking about the recommendation tracker, so the numbers remain fairly stable. There are a number that are due to come off shortly, so that number should hopefully dwindle. There's nothing of particular concern to me as the head of internal audit, but if you've got any questions about any particular recommendation at the end, then feel free to ask that. The work of the corporate fraud team continues, and that's in sections 5 to 9. And then the last part of the report is just an update on the annual governance statement to make sure that we are doing what we said as a council in the action plan. And again, there's work in all those areas continues. And again, I've got no concerns to bring to your attention. Thank you.
Are there any comments to be made by members of the committee? Thank you for that report, which we now accept. So we move on to the next item 8, the internal audits strategy and audit plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So the strategy will set out sort of the approach and what we're hoping to achieve. The detail of the actual audits we're going to do are in Appendix A. I don't intend to go through that, but if there are got any questions, then feel free to ask it. So as the Chief Internal Auditor, I have to produce at the end of each financial year an annual report on the give assurances on the risk management, the governance and the internal control framework. So I need to have an audit plan that covers all those areas, and I'll explain how I do that further down. So if we start off by looking at Section 3, the purpose of internal audit. So we're here to give you that independence assurance. We're also we need to recognise the key risks, so we've taken that on board in the audit plan. And it's also very important as internal audit that we're adding value. So we're just not doing just audits and giving you those assurances in those areas. We do a lot of advisory work. We make sure that we understand what the issues are for this particular council and get to the nub of things. And also, as part of a shared service, so we can share that good practice as well as making sure that we follow the public sector internal audit standards. So in Section 4 are the key principles set out by the Global Institute of Internal Auditors, and I particularly like the last two about internal audit being insightful, proactive and future focused, and promotes organisational improvement. So when we're making our recommendations, we're just not doing it for recommendations' sake because that's the way you should do things. It's because we understand Epping and it's the best way to bring it, to move everything forward for the council. So the key deliverables of this strategy is here to deliver the audit plan, as I said, and to make sure there is an integrated approach to assurances. So it's the risk management framework and other frameworks such as health and safety, and make sure that's all work. Management commitment is really important, and that's why we bring the recommendation tracker to you each time, because it's no good making recommendations if they're not implemented and people can't see the value of those. We're continuing improving our approach. So last year we did a lot of work around data analytics to make sure that we were skilled in that area, and we are continuing that for this year. And as I've said before, business insight is not making recommendations for recommendations' sakes, but understanding the council and making a difference. There's a set of performance indicators under Section 18. They're the same that we had last year, and I propose that we have those again for this year. And we'll report on how we've done in 22-23 in my annual report. So when thinking about the internal audit plan, I don't sit in a dark room, and well, I do sometimes, but think about what the audits should be. So one of the key things is to make sure that we're hitting the key risks of the council. So Appendix B is the assurance map, where we show the 3 lines of assurances. So the first line is where officers should be doing their job. We have policies and procedures, people should be following that. And hopefully that will make sure everything's working correctly. If that fails, then hopefully the second line of defence, where you have committees or you have some reconciliations or something like that, and then that hopefully pick up anything that's going wrong. And then your last level of defence is your independent assurance, which is your external auditors, your internal auditors, and any sort of consultants that you may use. So when we were looking at the risk register for Epping, and I'd sort of thought what audits I should do to give me that wide range of experiences of the council, it realised that we hadn't hit that homelessness risk that you'll see in the risk register, and therefore that's why that was put in for next year. So I know we look at the external environment, we see what's happening with changes in legislation, changes in technology. and I see what other councils are doing, and then I'm also looking at other councils within the shared service to see if there's any particular areas where they've had problems that perhaps I need to look at that at Epping to see if that's happening as well. And also, we understand Epping, you know, we're always talking to officers at all levels, and as part of the audit planning process, we will talk to all the directors and all the service directors, and we get the opinions of managers to help inform that audit plan. So the priority areas for 22-23, which is on section 25, they haven't really changed from the previous year. So information governance and looking at that. Risk management, we continue to help the council move that forward. Fraud, we're always looking out for fraud, and I also oversee the corporate fraud team. And value for money, so mainly in the sort of the 3 C's, economy, effectiveness and efficiencies, benchmarking within the shared service, looking at KPIs and things like that. And then supporting you as an audit committee as well. It's a very important role that we have. And then looking at the more operational level, so we always do some work around Qualis. That's our most significant partnership that we have, with a focus on Qualis Commercial next year, 22-23. We always do some work around the key financial systems. So in the old days, they were audited every year, and the main focus of the work, they tend not to change those processes. So if there's a significant change like debtors, we've got a new debtor system, then we will look at it. So we got those on a rolling programme of audits, and then the governance frameworks and how this all fits together, the risk management, the governance management, and how it all fits together. And then there's a note there on the data analytics. There's so much data out there, and we can do a lot of our audit work by looking at the data, and that helps focus where we actually want to do our work. So I've put that all those things into the audit plan. It's split up into 3 levels. So we start off with governance and trying to work out how we're going to do work in those areas. Then there's more the cross-cutting themes. And then underneath that is the more operational audits. And sometimes an audit that we do in one area will cover, say, the governance issue and vice versa. So working out how many days you're going to have, it's 451, which is slightly less than last year. And they're in table under 29 is the split of how we're going to do that work. So overall, I believe I've got a wide range of audits that I'm going to be delivering and reporting to you as an audit committee so that you can get your assurances or understand where the weaknesses are for the council. Thank you.
Any questions? Yeah. Councillor Owen.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, on Appendix B, it was the risk profile as of March 2023, and then it's got a number. Could you just explain to me how the number system works? It looks like it goes 1 to 25, and I assume that's where we are in the cycle as opposed to what the potential risk could be. So this links to the paper that you've got on risk later on in the agenda. So we have to assess risk, we have a 5x5 matrix of likelihood versus impact. And there are multiplications, so it's 1 to 5 on each scale. So if it's really going to have the risk going to have a high likelihood and a high impact, it's going to get a 5x5, give you 25. And it's based on what we call residual risk. So you have an inherent risk, and that's before you put any controls in place. And then we put some controls in place, and hopefully that will reduce the likelihood or the impact or both to a certain level. And then that gives you a score, and then a score gives you a colour.
Thank you. Tony.
Thank you, Chairman. One of the items, I'm happy with the report, it's fine, but one of the items talks about an audit of Qualis Commercial. Now, I think we're aware that the external auditor has been undertaking an audit of Qualis, and he used a private auditor in order to investigate that, to carry out that audit. Is it your intention to have access to the information available via the external auditor in the audit report that you are about to set upon this year? Thank you.
So our intention is we look at external audit reports as we would do for the council and see if there's any particular concerns that they've got. Likewise, they look at our reports and see if they've got any, we've got any concerns they need to be aware of.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, Councillor Matthews.
Thank you. It's not so much around the report, but just the detail within it about the debt, the sundry debt and the new system and taking that over and looking into it. They've obviously identified total outstanding debts are currently 5.5 million, of which 1.8 is over a year old. Who, obviously, if the auditing process discovers that, who is then charged with the responsibility of ensuring we get that back and processing that? Thank you.
So we identify an audit owner of that process, and that's who we work with. And then when we give our recommendations, it's for them to give their management responses. So they own that recommendation and agree to do those actions by that particular time.
Does that answer your question? You look as though you're...
Well, yeah, thank you. It does answer the question. I just feel like it needs a more pressing reaction. I know in some of the terms of money we talk about here, it's not necessarily the largest sum of money, but it is still a considerable sum of money. So I think this is something that definitely needs to be escalated up the ladder, perhaps out of this committee, and someone be dealing with this.
Can I ask Andrew to speak to this, please?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I can answer that one. I mean, there's a gap in between the audit being undertaken and the report being written up and then it being presented, obviously, to yourselves as members of the Audit Committee. And in that time, some of the actions and recommendations are being progressed anyway by officers of the Council. And I know Chris Hartgrove, my deputy 151 officer, has done quite a bit of work already around this one in particular in terms of, so a lot of the debts, for example, have been, over a year old and probably actually quite a lot older than that, and they stay on the books because there's always a chance that you might be able to collect some of those debts, but there comes a point in time when there's no realistic prospect of actually recovering those debts, and at that point we need to take some action to write those off. Otherwise they just stay part of the outstanding debt, really. And I know Chris has done a lot of work with the debtors team to address some of the older debt in terms of those that there's no realistic prospect of collecting, and actually making sure we're writing that off, and that's going through the delegated process to do those, really. And there's a threshold for certain debts at certain levels will go to the portfolio holder, for example, for sign-off, and below that certain can be done by me. So we've made quite a bit of progress already in that space, and we're also working with the debt recovery team as well to think about how we can be more effective across the organisation in terms of chasing those debts up. Hopefully that helps.
So we would expect a feedback from that in due course in the not too distant future, we hope, into the next municipal year for the committee. Thank you. Any other points? If we could then move on to the supplementary portion of this, which I think you've touched on, which is an interesting document, and now that I understand it, it's quite easy to understand. When you first look at it, you see lots of reds there. Those reds are not our fault. They're the intrinsic nature of risk. These risks occur, such as if you get in your car on a wet night, there is a risk. You've not caused that risk, but the wet weather has. So are there any points you would like to address specifically? Andrew, sorry.
If I may, Chair, so I'll just give a quick introduction, because the format of this report has changed. I mean, the members of the committee will be aware that we always present a risk register report as a standing item on this committee agenda. But I mean, as a result of us looking critically at the way that we do that and looking at best practice across the other elements of local government and public sector bodies, we've moved to a different reporting framework. So it's changed in terms of the reporting matrix. So it was a 4x4 grid, it's now a 5x5 grid, which intends to add a bit more granularity about the nature of the risks that we're facing as an organisation. The cover report itself highlights what those risks are, and you'll see that they're given a risk colour between red, amber and green. How they were when we last reported to you back in January, and how they are under the new matrix as of this meeting. They're not strictly comparable because we're using a different scoring scheme, but the colours will give you an indication about how some of those risks have changed. We've also done a bit of work to split out some of the risks that we were reporting, because we were reporting more upon the kind of the manifestation of the risk rather than the causes. So, for example, we were reporting on financial resilience as a risk, but that doesn't really tell you what's driving that risk, if you understand. So what we've done is to try and split that out into its components. So, whether it's whether the underlying financial pressures that are impacting upon the economy, or the position of Qualis in terms of the contribution that it makes to the council's overall budget. So we've tried to disaggregate those and give a bit more of a steer to the committee about how those risks are developing and what's causing the factors and what we're doing to try and treat the risks associated with those. We also added a new one around people strategy. So we're acutely aware that the council only works because it's got a cohort of officers that understand their technical areas of responsibility and give good advice to members, and good decisions are made and services provided. We are aware that there's a struggle right now to get qualified staff in certain areas, and if we don't address that, then actually the council will struggle to deliver some of its core services. So we've part of the workshop that we did with Zurich, our insurance providers, was to try and dig down a bit more into the individual risks and understand where they are and whether we've captured all the key ones. So we've added people strategy failure as a new risk on there as well. The appendix sets out in more detail, how the risks have been presented, and as the chair's already explained, that we talk about the underlying risk and then the residual risk after we've treated it with mitigating actions. So that's the one we need to focus on in terms of what are our big risks once we've taken remedial actions, and they're contained within the report. Largest ones still facing the organisation are things like contractor failure around waste, for example, demands for housing. Some of our business continuity is perhaps where we'd like it to be, really. So a lot of services do have business continuity plans, but there's not the uniform development and presentation of those business continuity plans across the whole council that we would like to see. So we're not, we think there are probably gaps, and we're working on filling those at the moment. Although I do believe that we have continuity plans for the biggest service areas, such as waste, for example. So that's it, Chair, in terms of all I wanted to add to this report. Happy to take any questions through you.
Okay, just as a comment, I think it's nicely laid out, provided you aren't colourblind, and you can see the trends, and we keep an eye on that. But any questions from members of the committee? Councillor Matthews.
More just a comment, really. I agree. I think it's definitely a better way of doing it, and I think it's very easy to follow and understand. So that's definitely a positive. Maybe a slight question: when we're identifying these risks, are we ever calling in officers relevant to say, for example, we've got you touched on contractor service, so the waste that we're high and very likely, so we're in the red there with a score of 16. Are we then could we actually identify that, say, look, we've identified that in audit, we want the officer or portfolio holders responsible for that to come to this committee, and we express our concerns of their risk position and have to engage in some kind of dialogue that way, so that everyone is fully aware, because I don't know, perhaps you could answer this as well, is this fed back to all the relevant people within the officers and the portfolio holders? So if the portfolio holder for waste and the officer in charge of that, are they fully aware that they are in that category, and obviously should be working to come away from that? Thank you.
Yes, Andrew.
Thank you. Absolutely, actually, and the risk matrix itself and the risks are developed through an officer working group. So as a senior leadership team within the organisation, we come together, we develop them, at a service level. Then we have to come together and sense check them within a senior leadership group to make sure that we understand as a leadership team across the council that we are cited upon what all of the risks are across the organisation. So we're looking at it rather than in silos. We're looking at it across the organisation. We also, yes, we share those with the portfolio holders, and it also gets reported as well to Cabinet in this form. So the Cabinet are aware of what the risks, because they're the risk owners really at the end of the day. Your role, as you correctly point out, is to make sure that somebody's identifying them and taking some remedial action to make sure that the risk doesn't manifest if it can be avoided. And absolutely, I think it's within your gift as well. If you're not satisfied that a risk is being properly managed, and risk is within this committee's remit, then you can call individuals or portfolio holders to account in this space if you wish to ask them to give you assurance that the risk is being properly managed and properly addressed.
Thank you. Again,
if I could just come back on that, thank you for that. And I think, that's definitely something this committee should look at doing more of, and monitoring it over a period of time. And okay, there's a change of matrix, but we know where our higher risk sectors are. And actually, if we could turn around and say, look, we've assessed this risk, the area that you're responsible for, officer A, B or C, has been in the high risk and the high likelihood for 3 consecutive years now. What are you doing to try and either make the occurrences less likely or to bring that level of risk down? I think that's something we should be doing.
I would imagine you can't, as a cabinet and a portfolio holder, greatly influence the inherent risk. But it's the second column of the residual risk score that needs to be watched. So this is prepared monthly? Because it has the statement March 2023. How often is this produced and updated?
Essentially in line with the agenda preparation for the Audit and Governance Committee. So it mirrors the schedule of meetings for this committee.
Okay, fine. Because often if changes occur in the wrong direction too rapidly, it misses getting to this committee fast enough. But we do have this committee reasonably frequently, so we can spot that and feed it back quickly. Yes.
And if there are risks that are changing dynamically within the organisation, and for example, waste collection, we don't just think about it every audit committee cycle. We're working on it as officers, working with portfolio holders on a daily basis to address the risks that are dynamic in that space. This is really us reporting back to the Audit and Governance Committee to say that we are aware of these risks, and these are the things that we are focused on as an organisation in terms of giving highest priority to. And again, it's your opportunity to say, well, what about this risk? What about that? Shouldn't this be within your list of things that you're concerned about as well? And that's the purpose of it, is to say this is what we're aware of, this is what we think we should be reporting upon, and this is your opportunity to come back to us and say, no, well, we think that's right, that's wrong, or you should be looking at this.
Thank you. Tony, sorry.
Well, sort of following on from that point, I've got a couple of points to make, but the first one is that I'm not sure what information members get about what happens in other local authorities of a similar nature to ourselves, and to some extent I'm a member of SIPFA, and so I receive weekly bulletins about what's happening in other councils, what are their troubles, what are the plus points and things. But you do get to understand from general publications, not difficult to find, about what is the experience of other councils, and particularly on some of these red line risks, to be honest. And I'm not sure what members receive on that at the moment, and whether it's something that, if it's not thought about, could be thought about at the next, before the next meeting, possibly. I've got another point to make, but...
Yes, if there anybody who can help me answer that, in that I'm not aware of a direct communication from other committees to this committee, although we do share an auditor with a neighbouring council, and there will be communication there, implied communication. But Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, you rightly point out some of there have been a series of failed organisational activities, if you want to call it, investments or other business activity or commercial activities in recent years. And not just about commercial either, really, just poor governance arrangements on the part of some local authorities. I mean, you would go back a few years, Northamptonshire County Council was very much in the media. And more recently, we've seen the troubles at Croydon, Slough, Nottingham, and Thurrock, of course, not least of all, really, probably the most prominent example of which, of course. I think as officers, and members as well, and we look to these quite carefully to make sure and measure ourselves against them and see what the pitfalls were, what the mistakes have been, where the gaps in governance might have been, and we compare ourselves against those to see whether we're reassured that those similar kind of mistakes couldn't happen in our own organisations. And certainly our Chief Executive has asked Sarah to do a comparative piece, really, around some of those most recent examples and report that back, I think. Are you planning to report that back to this committee?
So in the audit plan, I have got a comparison against definitely Thurrock, but also being in Essex, so that will come back to the committee.
Tony.
The other point was a specific point, which again is partly covered by the risk when it refers to the financial viability of Collis, which is obviously one of the issues. But the fact is that at this last meeting we saw, and I think Council has since approved, a capital strategy where I think, is it £40 million of money, is that the right figure? Yeah. Could be borrowed from Public Works Loans Board and passed on to Qualis and used for property development. Now, while this is obviously intended for the best, there are risks involved in that, and it doesn't depend necessarily on Qualis itself. The risk is in that the council will be left with a lot of debt for which it has no offsetting income. And that as a risk doesn't appear here. Now, it's a fairly new risk, and in fact, we don't know that it's going to materialise because it depends on the borrowing that is actually undertaken and the amounts that are passed to Qualis. But I would perhaps ask that be considered whether it should be included next meeting if, by that time, it isn't appropriate to do so.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. I think this is one of the reasons that we did disaggregate the financial resilience risk into component parts, and one of the reasons I think that Qualis has specifically got one of those, one of those disaggregated categories, really, because I think it is one of the council's larger financial interests at this moment in time. I think in our scoping of this, it is referencing as some of the capital and treasury management activities in relation to Qualis. That was in our minds when this was drafted, so I think it does attempt to cover that. Whether it's as explicit as perhaps we can make reference to the value of the loans in there, but it does cover the risk in terms of what we're trying to describe in this place. And it also, and it does highlight the activities that we're doing really to make sure that that risk doesn't manifest into a real loss to the council one way or the other. So it talks about the enhanced reporting, it talks about the regular monitoring, it talks about the cash flow positions, it talks about how the officers are taking actions to make sure that we can report to members that the risk is being managed and reported to yourselves really as well. So I think that's what this new risk is there for actually, and I think it does cover what you've described. If you want it to be more specific in terms of the elements of the risk, then we can flesh that out for the next iteration.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the response. I mean, my concern was focused particularly on the amount of debt that the authority has taken on, and it is seen as simply as that, as opposed to the position of Qualis. Now, it is because of the size of the monies we're talking about that it would be certainly an element I'd expect to see there about how the debts, how secure the debt is. And this looks like it's directed towards the Qualis, the company, rather than the debt. So I was suggesting that perhaps a little more emphasis on that, should that debt be taken up, would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think there are two separate risks in there maybe. So one is the size or the overall amount of borrowing that the council's taking. So that's one risk, and that one isn't probably reflected in here at the moment, and maybe that's something we need to focus on developing. The other one is the purpose for which it's used, and whether that in itself represents a risk to the council in terms of non-repayment. I would say, of course, that there are other mitigating factors, for example, in terms of mitigations in terms of our risk of non-repayment. That is one is that we take security against any assets that are used or purchased with that money, really. So we try to protect the council's position by making sure that all our debt is secured on assets. But I'll certainly take the point about overall size of debt back, and we'll consider about developing a new risk for that potentially for the next presentation on risk to the council.
Councillor Owen.
Just a question on that. Why do we need to take security over the assets when we own the company 100%?
So this goes back to administration and the rules around sort of liquidation in the event of bankruptcy, isn't it really? So the company goes into administration, then they are required to appoint an administrator, and the administrator will sell its assets to whoever party offers it the best return. And that doesn't necessarily mean, I suppose, that that's going to be the council, I guess. So we might want to retain security over those, and a legal charge, gives us more control over the assets that are acquired by Qualis, and therefore in a bankruptcy situation, or should it ever occur, we hope that it does not, then we have more control over the assets that the council, that the Qualis holds.
Thank you. Any other points raised by this risk register, which, as I said, is a much better presentation, and will allow us to follow it in more detail and hold people accountable to the fact that it moves from the red to the orange and doesn't. Anyway, thank you. We've said any other business, which I believe there is not. No reason to exclude the public. We've got nothing naughty to report. So I close this meeting at 7:40. Yes, have I got that right? Yes, thank you.